I was reviewing a video or a clip with Rupert interacting with a woman, and she asked him a question that is a question that would be an obvious question if you really gave it some contemplation or some thought. She said to him, "You tell us that free will is not actual, that free will is an illusion, that there is no free will. And then you give us instructions to do something. So you tell us there's no doer, and then you give us instructions to do something. So which, you're talking out of two sides of your mouth, you know? Both of those things can't be simultaneously true." And it's a good question, isn't it? Right? Because we talk, I've talked here about there not being a doer and there's no free will and predetermination. And I explained it in a way that you could see what I'm talking about. And then I gave you a technique that telling you to do something specific in order to meditate in a more advanced way, right? So it's a good question because it really allows for the possibility of getting into something that is really not often spoken of. I think as far as I can recall, Rupert's the only one who I think speaks about this. And what it is that he speaks about is he talks about this business of making concessions. So one way to talk about this is to say, obviously the sun doesn't move, right? The sun doesn't move. And yet we talk about the sun coming up and going down, don't we? Yeah. So while the sun doesn't move, from a particular point of view, it appears to move. And we relate to the appearance, right? We relate to the appearance without necessarily remembering that the sun doesn't move, so we live more in the world that it does than it doesn't. We talk about beautiful sunsets, beautiful sunrises, high noon, the whole 9 yards. And we actually, and our the time divisions around the world are divided according to where the sun is, right? But the reality is the sun doesn't move. In the same way, if I tell you to practice a certain thing or use a particular technique, right, I'm talking to you as a person who has a particular point of view. And from your point of view as a person, which you can't help, right, because you were conditioned to be this, and your brain is conditioned to be this. Right? So I'm talking to you as a person like talking to somebody who operates as if the sun moves. That doesn't mean that it's true that you're a person, obviously, because we talk about the fact that you're not a person. Right? But while we're talking about the fact that you're not a person, in order for our process of understanding and evolving to continue here, there has to be a concession made about who I'm talking to. If I talk to you as what you actually are, ideally, as Ramana Maharshi attempted to do in the beginning, I wouldn't say anything, right? Because if I'm talking to you as who you actually are, no words can convey it. It would just be silence. We would just sit here together. And when Ramana Maharshi did that, there were people who actually woke up in his presence, right? Of course, they then attributed to him as having the power to wake them up, which wasn't the case at all. But then after a while, he began to talk as a concession, right? Because people were saying to him, well, I'm not experiencing self-realization. I've been coming and sitting here, and I've been doing these things for decades and reading books, and I haven't experienced self-realization. So can you tell me something? Tell me something to do. They're asking him to tell me something to do. Now, he knows there's no doer, right? But as a concession to speak to where they're coming from, you see, to speak to the understanding they have, to speak to the way that they're identifying themselves, whether they realize it or not, he then gave them something to do. And he said two things. He said, well, you can either start to practice self-inquiry, that's something to do, you know, which means that you begin to keep asking, who is it that's having this thought? Who is it that's having this feeling? Who is it that's doing these things? And keep looking to notice the answer to that question, right, as a practice. Or he said the other thing you can do is surrender, right? Surrendering would mean that you just give up the idea that there's anything that you can do that's going to make any difference, right? Which is true. Right? So this business of concession is an important thing to understand. It's necessary. It's necessary in order for you to because then, you see, with the concession, then if I say to you, well, turn your attention inward, you know, the inward facing attention, or practice this I am technique, right? By using what you think is free will, okay? Because remember, if you're oriented as a separate self, if you're oriented as a separate person and you're identified with your body, right? Which is still the case. That's the program that's still running for you, yes? If you're oriented for that, can you see that in that orientation, you must consider yourself to have agency. You must consider yourself to be the doer. It goes along with the idea that you're separate from everybody else. If you're separate from everybody else, then in order for you to get something, you have to do something, right? So that's the foundation of being a separate self, is to be a doer. That's what I've been talking about here, is that when you understand there's no doer, when you understand there's no free will, and you are willing to look and see the reality of it, that's a very powerful way of undoing your idea of being a separate self. So as long as that idea that you are a doer, and as long as the idea that you do have free will is going on, then if the teacher is going to be skillful, they have to speak to that. They have to talk to the one who thinks they can do something, right? And as you well know, right, one of the things that happens is you as a person attempts not to be a person, right? You as a person attempts to be self-realized. You as a person attempts to be awareness itself, which means you're a doer. You as a separate person are trying to be the self, right? However, the interesting irony is that as that person who thinks you have free will, if you use that free will to choose to practice certain things, right? The practicing of those things will dissolve the idea that you have free will and dissolve the idea that you're a doer and you're a person. That's what the practices do. They dissolve it, right? Very interesting, because it's the person wanting to get what the person thinks self-realization, enlightenment will give them, right? Isn't that true? The person wants what they think this will give them. You hear all these good stories about, oh, well, you'll have everlasting peace, right? You'll be blissful. You'll be happy. It'll be your nature, right? So the person hears that and says, well, I want that. I want that. And I'm not having that now. I must not be that now because I'm not having that now. Therefore, in order to have that, I have to do something. That's the way the person operates, right? So the teacher has to talk to that person who thinks they can do something to get, now what? The teacher has to talk to the person who thinks they can do something to get what they already have. And then they have to try to do that. And the thing that's interesting is I can tell you from up here, from watching, right? You can't help it. You will understand you're not the person, right? And as a person, try not to be the person. You'll understand, and you'll still do it, because the brain will continue to operate like your separate self. Now, one of the things, and one of the reasons I think this is worth talking about for a while, this business of free will and self-determination, right, is because it's a very difficult thing for people to get, right? It's one of the most difficult concepts for people to get. And the thing that they say about it is that, okay, look, if what you're saying is true, if predetermination is the case, and if there's no free will, then my understanding of that, especially somebody who's got a religious background, my understanding of that is you're telling me that God is willing to have these horror shows occur, that God is willing for children to die, God is willing for innocent people to die, right? That's what you're telling me, right? And so then the person says, I can't accept that, okay? But here's the deal. The reason you can't accept that is because you're viewing it as a person. And the reality of it is that when awareness manifests itself in the life of a human being, which means it manifests itself as a contracted, limited, separate self, right? When awareness manifests itself as a contracted, limited, separate self, then that separate self feels separated from everything. Feels separated from other people, feels separated from the world, right? Feels threatened. Remember, fear is the constant state of mind for the mind, is fear, right? They feel separated from other people, they feel separated from the world, they feel threatened, right? And this separation and this threat starts to become more and more convoluted into these mental states, right? Of fear, threat, hatred, right? Hatred, nationalism, racism, right? The way the mind perpetuates itself in the world is by domination, isn't it? That's why marriage doesn't work. Right? Because two minds get together, right? When they get together, in the beginning they're in love, so their minds are one, right? One mind when they're in love. And then that passes, and after that passes, it's like, who's going to be in charge here? That's when the fight starts, right? So, but this is inherent to the condition, right? Once this condition sets in, then a world that is consistent with that condition appears, right? Which means you have to be in control. You have to avoid being dominated. You have to protect yourself, right? That's the world we're living in, right? So, now that's an appearance, that's not actually the truth, right? But it seems very real and very true, does it not? Right? And it is very real and very true in the sense that at a relative level, that's the condition that exists when people don't know who they are. That's the condition that exists when the mind and the brain is fear-based, right? And it's operating in a way to try and be in control and manipulate the world and not be controlled by the world. And that can get into crazy places like Hitler, right? That was what was going on with Hitler, you know. I'm going to control the world, right? The white German race, Aryan race, is going to control the world, right? That's how crazy it can get, right? And if you look at the world now and you look at politics and everything, you can see it's the same thing. People against people, right? Everybody's trying to control the resources, right? All of that, right? But you see, that's inevitable once the condition is in place. It's just, it has to be that way. I mean, I think Rupert said that God had to pay a price to have people come into a human life, and that is to let go, let them forget the truth, let them forget who they are, let go, let them believe they have free will, right? So in an awakened state, now, and in this world that is like this, right, it makes sense to fight evil, right? If somebody, you know, if you're an awakened being, that doesn't mean if somebody comes to stab you that you just say, oh, this is meant to be. No, your brain won't let that happen. You know, you'll fight for your life, right? As a separate person from the person trying to hurt you, right? Same thing on a larger scale. You know, people who see these quote-unquote evil forces in the world, right, that are doing damage and destruction, that are coming from an ego-based reality, there are people who are fighting that evil, right? I saw this woman the other day. For some reason, I was invited to attend this online webinar by this director of this documentary that he did on spiritual stuff, and he had this woman that was a guest, and it just, you know, things came together, and I was in front of my computer and I saw that it was happening. I didn't know these people, but I figured, well, what the hell? Maybe I'm supposed to look at this thing. So I turned it on. And this woman is being interviewed by this guy. She's a black woman, and probably in her 70s, right? And he's interviewing her, and the context is the spiritual context of this webinar. So I'm trying to figure out, well, how's it a spiritual context? So he's interviewing her, and she's sharing about how she was part of the civil rights movement, how she dropped out of college as a sophomore, and she was the only person in her family that ever went to college, but she dropped out as a sophomore to join the civil rights movement, and her family was really upset about that, right? But she felt she had to do that, and she was there for, you know, the march in Selma, and, you know, very active in civil rights. And then she was later active in feminism, you know, and women's rights, and traveled to the East and spent time in Cambodia and Syria and this and that. She had a PhD at this point, and she was teaching in Florida at a university. So she's talking about all this stuff, and then at one point she said that she found out about a guy in the Mideast who was a Sufi master. And somebody, through a friend of hers or somebody, told her that they were going to bring this Sufi master over to this country to teach. And so they worked it out. They struggled to get him a visa and so forth, but they worked it out, and they finally got him over here to Philadelphia. And he was this Sufi master, and she became a student of this Sufi master, right? She was originally a Christian, you know. But she became a student of the Sufi master, took on a Sufi name from him, and became an Islamic follower, because Sufism is a mystical form of Islam. And so she became a student with this Sufi master, and he stayed here for 8 months, and she took on his teaching, which is the same kind of stuff we talk about here, right? Because there's teaching self-realization and so forth, the wisdom teachings. They're the same in Sufi as they are in Hinduism and Buddhism. So she had that exposure, and she had that learning. So now I'm really interested, right? So the guy said, well, if you're watching and you have a question, you can type it in on the comments thing. So I go over and I type in, what's your understanding of thy will be done? I wanted to know, right, from this woman, what's your understanding of thy will be done? And if it is the case that everything is in God's hands, how do you function?
Is this recent?
Yeah. This was just the other day. It was recorded. If I find the recording, I'll send it. Yeah. So the guy posted my question on the screen and asked her the question, right? And she said, oh no, I have free will. I don't believe that stuff. I absolutely have free will. God gave me free will. So I thought that was an interesting response on her part, because if that was her response, then I wondered how far she got in her understanding of the wisdom teachings, because that's a very central part of the understanding of the wisdom teachings of non-duality, right? If non-duality is real, it means you don't exist, and if you don't exist, there's no possibility of having free will. So when I heard her response, I thought, well, that's very interesting. And then I thought about it, and I realized, of course, how the hell could she see it any other way? As a black woman during the civil rights movement, how could you entertain the possibility that you don't have free will? You see what I'm saying? So that's a good example of how it occurs to people that you have free will, right? And then I went on the website of this Sufi master that she spoke about, right, to check him out. And it said his latest book, you know what the title of his latest book was? Destiny. When this shit happens, I say to myself, man, talk about synchronicity, you know? So I ordered the book. Now I want to read what this guy has to say about destiny, right? But see, the thing is this, if you see things as they are, if you're awake and you see things as they are, it means that you could be in the civil rights movement, you could be in the Vietnam protests, you could be in the, you know, any of these things that go on like that. You could fight evil in the world, right? The only difference between you and other people who don't have these teachings, right, is you could kill somebody who is threatening other people's lives, right, and not be angry at them and not do it with any emotional reaction. Because you would know who they really are, right, but they don't know who they really are, and what you're killing is who they think they are. Whereas somebody else would where somebody else could do this as an act of violence coming from their hatred and their anger. You see what I'm saying? And in that case, I'll say this anyway, it's one of those things that you get it or you don't. If it was coming from hatred and anger, it would be a sin. If it was coming from a self-realized person that had compassion and had no anger, a reaction to the person, but still killed the person, that would not be a sin. Because that person would know that that was the will of God acting, not them.
Try that defense in court.
What's that?
Try that defense.
Oh, I'm not talking about the social situation, you know. The social situation is different from reality, right? Because the social situation is based on controlling human behavior, right? And because that's the case, you know, even if you acted out of thy will be done, you still go to jail. You will be punished because your behavior is inconsistent with the need to control people. It's as simple as that. So this business of free will and determination is an important piece here for you to understand and to be able to incorporate it into this work. And the thing about the self-determination part, a lot of people have a problem with that. You know, like Ramesh Balsekar talked about determination by saying the film is already in the can. Everything that's going to happen has already happened, right? Nothing can change. The will of God, everything that happens can only happen with the will of God, and it's all already over. It's all predetermined. But the thing you have to understand about that is he's referring to the way it is for the average person. And the way it is for the average person is you can only act consistent with your DNA and your conditioning, right? You can't think a thought outside of that. And your behavior will come directly from that. There's no place for it to come from but that, and it'll be limited, right? That's the film in the can, right? However, when you recognize and accept that there's no free will, when you recognize it and accept that there's no person, right, then what's left? What? Well, you could call it, that's one way to call it, but another way to call it is thy will be done is what's left, right? Take the person out of the picture, what's left? The source, right? So when you take the person out of the picture and the source is what's left, now the film's not in the can anymore. Now the film's happening, now the film's being made now. And the future is not a function of the past. In the movie that's in the can, what's going to happen is dependent on what has happened, right? It's a story, right? But when you transcend that, the film's not in the can anymore. Now the film's being made in real time, and you're the director and the producer because you're the source. Which means your future is an open possibility. Anything can happen. That's why you see people who have spiritual awakenings make dramatic changes in their life. Ask my wife. We were talking about this last night, and you know, she said, "Do you remember when you said this and you did that and how crazy you were?" And I said, "Yeah, I remember that." I said, "I'm very grateful that that's over." But you see, you can, you know, when you wake up and you're not the same, right? When your future is different and you're not the same as you were in the past, you can look back at it and take total responsibility for it. I was crazy. And you know, the interesting thing about that is when I said that to her, she said, yeah, I was too. I was crazy for putting up with you. So you can talk about these things in a lighthearted way, you know, when you're not still in the drama, when you're still not in the horror show. All right, get out of here.